morning. Welcome back to Duck River Homestead. Today we're going to be planting out the second phase of the garden. The first phase in the garden I planted out our tomatoes and some nasturtium and some flowers that would do okay with temps that were still at night in like the 30s and 40s. So now that our nighttime temperatures are going to be in the 50s or higher, it looks like that for the next 2 weeks, I feel safe to put out our peppers and our cucumbers and our basil, and I'm also direct seeding some beans. I probably could have done that earlier, but I'm just now getting to it. But as I'm doing this, I'm just laying out where I think the spacing is for the plants. I'm removing the mulch so that I can access the soil directly. If I can, some of the things I'm adding a layer of some extra soil just to give it some good nutrient dense soil at transplant. I even did that with the beans. I just made a trench. I lined up where I wanted to direct sow the bean seed, and I lined it up to the trellis. They're pole beans, so that means that I can trellis them and they will climb. So I just did it in line with the cattle panel and spaced it out because it's convenient that each square in the cattle panel is 6 inches apart, and that's how far apart I wanted my beans. So I planted some of those, and then I added some soil, and then I just did the beans directly in the soil, and then I watered them in. So with the direct sowing, I want the seed to sprout. I'm going to leave the straw mulch kept away from those seeds, but everything else that I'm transplanting with the basil, the cucumbers, and the peppers, once I get the transplants in the ground, I'm going to water them in. I'll get some footage of that because I didn't get any footage of when I did that with the tomatoes too. I water them in, just holding the hose as close to the base of the plant. I don't necessarily want to be watering the leaves. I'm wanting to water the soil and get the roots to go out. I just do that for 10 seconds for each plant, and then I go back for 15 seconds. Sometimes I even come back to do 20 seconds, but I often don't have time. So I do that, and then I will reapply the straw mulch. Another reason why I wanted to do this today, in addition to the nighttime temperatures being warmer, is we're about to get some rain tomorrow and the next day. So ideally, I can water these in, and then they get some fresh rain over the next couple days to really help them root in the ground well. One thing I'm doing as I'm going through and planting my basil is I'm pruning the basil just like I did with the tomatoes as I'm planting. So I want my basil plants to not just go up, but to go out and to produce more leaves, because pesto takes a lot of basil. So I'm just finding at the top, and I'm pruning the tops. Tomatoes you don't prune the top, but basil you do. And I'm just pruning, like, see how there's these 2 leaves here? I'm gonna prune here. And they're pretty small right now that I can do that. I only need to really do one. I mean, maybe I could go down to here if I wanted to, but I'm not. So I'm doing that. And then also when I started these, I did 2 seeds per cell. And so when I'm planting them, I'm actually separating them. So now I have 2 plants. Okay, it's a couple weeks later, but we're gonna close out this series on planting out the spring and summer garden. Partially because I think 3 videos is enough, and also because it's pretty much done. I say pretty much because I always hesitate to say it's finished, because there's always one more thing that I find to do or plant. The last 4 things that I actually planted out were cucumbers, peppers, basil, and okra. For the cucumbers, I actually did 2 different varieties. I did salt and pepper and a homemade pickle, or a homemade cucumber. Either homemade or Homestead. I think it's homemade pickle cucumber. I only did 4 or 5 of each variety. With my cucumbers, I trellis them pretty similarly to the way I do tomatoes, spacing them out and putting them directly underneath the cattle panel, so that way as it grows, it can grow up. And the cucumbers I actually put on these arched trellises, rather than the tomatoes are just on the one that just goes straight up. I do prune my cucumbers very similarly to the way I prune tomatoes, in the sense that I focus the plant on making roots and growing up and doing leaves and foliage and growing before flowering, by taking off any of the flowers, especially if it starts to do that before it even reaches the trellis and I'm able to attach it to the trellis. Last year I didn't feel like it needed any help. This year I feel like both varieties of cucumbers needed help getting to the trellis. They kept just growing underneath the trellis, and that's fine for a while, but eventually I need to train them to go up. So I just got some twine that is biodegradable, so that way when I'm done in the garden I can just pull it out and leave it in the ground. I just cut some string and I attached the plant to the trellis for the beginning. I don't plan on doing that all throughout the growing season, just in the beginning so that it has some support and can get to that trellis faster. Because for whatever reason, the tendrils this year weren't wrapping around the cattle panel to help it. When pruning the cucumbers, there's 3 things that I'm looking for. The main leaf that's going to be next to the flower that's going to bear fruit, and then the tendril. And so when I see those 3 together, I keep those, but if there's any other shoots that come off, those are basically like a sucker, I'll cut those branches off, because what's going to happen is it's just going to try to create more foliage, and yes, it might create more fruit, but it's going to get so big and bushy and wide in the hot, humid summers that we get here. I would rather reduce the foliage to give it more airflow for the plant and just focus it on one main stem that's going up the arch. For peppers, this is actually my first year doing peppers. I don't particularly care for peppers. However, it's spicy peppers that I don't care for. So I'm learning that there's all kinds. I already know there's a pepper that I want to try next year that I didn't start this year. It's called a jalapeno. I don't know where to get it, but I've heard of them. But this year, I did 4 different varieties of peppers, mostly for Brian and Bridget. Bridget says that she likes spicy, but I'll let her think that. We did some jalapenos. I do use that for some cooking, and then I will make Brian some cowboy candy. And then I also tried a shishito pepper, which I was not familiar with until I started gardening. It's not really a variety that you can get at the grocery store, which is one of the reasons that I actually have enjoyed gardening, is being able to plant and grow things that I can't get in my grocery store. And I've heard that it's really good blistered with like a homemade aioli, so I'm going to try that this year. And then I also am doing some sweet banana peppers for Brian. Maybe the girls will like them too. And then some lunch box peppers that I got from a friend. Her kids love them. My kids think they're going to love them. So if my kids are asking for lunchbox peppers, I'm going to get them some in the garden. I only did about 3 or 4 pepper plants per variety. And when I planted them in a V pattern, about 6 inches apart, because I've heard the phrase and it helps me remember that peppers like to hold hands. And so they like to be somewhat close together. So I did them near one of my first tomato rows. They're right next to my tomatoes, but just in a V pattern. A couple months after I had started my pepper plants, when they were still inside, I went ahead and trimmed off the top of the pepper plant in order to help encourage bushier growth. I don't do that with all of my plants, but peppers you can do that. And I know you can do that throughout the season, not just in the very beginning. I haven't done it since, but I did do that to help encourage bushier growth so it doesn't just be really tall and skinny. And then I transplanted them out, and I actually even put tomato cages on them. Technically they're a support cage, but when you find them at the garden store, they're often labeled as tomato cages. But funny enough, I'm not using any of them on my tomatoes. I'm using them on my peppers because I've seen other gardeners doing that to help them with their peppers when they get larger and they need a little bit more support. To clarify, I have seen gardeners use the tomato trellises on their determinate tomatoes, but because all of my tomatoes are indeterminate, I'm not using that type of tomato cage. Next, I transplanted out basil. I actually mentioned before how I did a lot more varieties of basil this year than I did last year. I ended up with 7. I can't recall all of them right now, but I will list them so you can just see the different types that I'm trying. I'm experimenting with where I'm placing the basil plants this year. I wanted to create a hedge next to my tomatoes, but one row I chose to do the basil hedge directly next to the tomatoes and then plant other flowers or vegetables on the outside. So basically it went trellis with tomatoes, then right next to that was the basil, and then in front of that are smaller, shorter, not as tall items. And then with the other row, I decided to do the tomatoes that were trellis and then give some space to plant some taller items. And then on the outer edge of that row, I did the basil hedge. And I'm kind of curious to see, do I have a preference as far as having the basil right next to the tomatoes versus having some things planted in between the tomatoes and the basil hedge. I don't know if I'll end up with a preference because of either pest control, maybe one is better than the other. I don't know if just aesthetically I'll like something better, or if when it comes time to actually harvest, if I'll find that one is an easier setup than the other. So I was willing to experiment with that this year. There are a few reasons why I planted so much basil. One of which is that pesto, when you're making it, it requires many cups of basil, and I just wanted to be sure that I had enough. I also wanted to try a couple different varieties than just your generic basil for homemade pesto. I'm curious to see if our family has a preference as to which type of basil we use to make homemade pesto. And last year I also learned how to make homemade basil tea. It's like an iced tea. It's really refreshing as like a summer beverage, and each variety of basil has a different flavor. So a lemon basil and a Thai basil and a cinnamon basil, they're going to have a slight variance in what they taste like because it's a different variety. And so I'm really curious to see again if there's one that we prefer, and so I'm looking forward to sometime this summer having almost like a basil tea tasting and just lining up 5 or 6 different kinds and having the girls and I try the different kinds and picking which one we like. And it'll help me to maybe know for next year, maybe there's some varieties of basil that I would like to do more of and some that I don't need to plant at all. I also wanted extra basil because they're beautiful in floral arrangements, and I wanted to be sure that I had enough to use not just for fresh eating but also for storing, and whether it be dehydrating or make that homemade pesto or to just use it in dishes over the summer. So I'd rather have too much than too little. One of the last things that I planted out last week was our okra. I think I mentioned in a previous video how we didn't really eat okra prior to gardening, and so last year I took advantage of our local farmer's market and I took home some okra to see, does our family even enjoy this? We did enjoy it, even just like fresh and raw. I tried cooking it a couple different ways, not with a huge success. A couple were, but we liked it enough that I felt like it was worth planting a couple in the garden so that I can try to find a few more recipes that I like. Like I haven't even tried frying it because I can't do gluten, and so I at least can do a gluten-free flour at home and I can try that. But I've seen it used in like soups and stews and gumbos and things like that, so I'm going to try a few this year. I only planted 2 different varieties. I'm hoping to get maybe 2 plants out of each variety. I did just the classic Clemson, and then a friend gave me some red okra, and I learned this year that when you're direct sowing into the ground, you want to overseed. So more so than if you are starting indoors. It's just a more controlled environment when you're indoors, and so you're not as likely to have insects coming and eating your seedlings or birds. And so when you're doing it outside, inside, if I have high germination rate, I will sometimes just do that 1 seed. Outside, I am direct sowing 2 or 3 seeds, always, just to help prevent against losing some of them. I did that last week. I already have some of the Clemson have sprouted, but nothing germinated from the red okra, so I do have time. I'm going to do that again. One of the reasons why I didn't transplant out the okra is because it's not really beneficial to start it inside and then plant it before temperatures are like in the 70s. It really likes it hot, and so I figured I'll just save space inside when I was doing all the start, and I just waited until temperatures were warm enough so that I could direct sow into the ground. So picking and choosing which things you want to start indoors and which you'll just do outside when it's the right conditions is part of the learning curve. So far I think that's what I prefer. The one thing that I am worried about with the okra is it can get up to like 8 or 10 feet tall, and when I planned for the garden I thought I had accounted for that, but once everything was in, there was really only 1 spot left for the okra to go, and I'm a little worried about it shading out my plant. I planted the okra on the row where I have my tomatoes with the basil right next to the tomatoes. And I wish I had done it on the one where the basil was on the outer edge, because I know that the okra is going to get taller than the basil. And so I'm a little worried about the okra shading out the basil. I don't know if that's going to be a problem or not. I figured I didn't really have any other options. My only option was to not plant okra this year and wait until another year, and I didn't want to lose a whole year of learning. So I decided to just go ahead and plant them. I'll see if it gets too tall and it shades out some of my other plants. But there's only one way to learn, to try. The only way to guarantee we have no okra this year is to not plant seeds. So I opted to plant seeds instead. Interspersed throughout the garden, I've placed different flowers. I do have more flowers to plant out later. I really need to get them in the ground because we're getting pretty late in the season. But I have already done some marigolds, some dahlias, and some snapdragons. I do have some perennials that I had planned on doing in front of our home. However, I don't think that bed is going to be ready this summer. We have too many other things, projects that we're working on. And so I hesitate to put those perennials in the garden because I feel like this garden is much more annual. And I know I can plant them and move them later, but I've also seen certain flowers that just reseed like crazy, and I don't know that I want to do that to future Sarah, having to figure out all that, everything that's reseeded and germinated and moving it all. So I'm still undecided. It is too late for me to do potatoes, so I've opted to not do potatoes this year, and so that section is just open. Later on I will figure out what I'm doing. So that's why I say the garden is done, but not quite. I do have more flowers to plant. I did plant out some flowers in the garden. I did some marigolds, some lantana, some snapdragons, some nasturtium, some dahlias. I'm not a huge sunflower fan, but the girls have some in their garden. And I did some zinnias. We'll see if I plant some. I know I wanted to get some lavender at a local nursery, so I think that's one of the only flowers I have. I do have perennials that I had wanted to plant in front of the house, but I don't think that's going to happen this season. That'll have to be another season. So I'm debating on whether I just let those flowers go or if I put them in this garden where I had planned on putting the potatoes, because it is now too late to do potatoes. And I'm debating whether I want to put perennial flowers in there when I know I could just move them later. But I also don't know that future Sarah is going to really enjoy that task, especially some of them like celosia can reseed like crazy. So the verdict is still out for debate on that one. I don't know where I'll land. I would hate to see all those beautiful flowers go. Oh, and I have peonies too. I did also plant out watermelon and cantaloupe. I did a Moon and Star variety for watermelon, and then I did Sarah's Choice, I believe. Either that or Hearts of Gold. I did one and Bridget did the other. For cantaloupe, I just did direct sowing, and for the watermelon, I've done both, where I have 2 that were started indoors ahead of time, and then I transplanted, and I also did 2 in ground just to see which I like better, or if one performs in the other. If I lose one, I have another. I hope this was helpful to see how the layers kind of stack on each other as far as when planting out the garden, what to do first, how to piece it out so that way it's not so overwhelming that you're doing it all in one day, and what factors to consider, when to know when to transplant something out and how. Like, what conditions are you looking for? What's flexible and what isn't? I know that was a huge learning curve for me last year, and I'm still learning that. But I'm excited to look back on this in a couple years and see what I've learned, how much I've grown, both in like actual produce, but also just as a gardener. Okay, I actually went back and I showed you a little bit of the flowers that we have in the garden, because I always forget one, like I'd forgotten borage. And then also because lest you think I'm into gardening for the vegetables, I have always loved flowers. I'm actually surprised that I didn't get into gardening earlier purely for cut flowers or like a cottage garden. For whatever reason, I started gardening with vegetable gardening, and then I'm adding in the flowers. When pre-gardener, Sarah has always loved flowers. I've not always loved vegetables. But I just think that there's nothing more beautiful than just fresh cut flowers on your kitchen table or in your kitchen on the counter wall. It beautifies inside, and flowers always make you smile. So at least flowers always make me smile. So I love that about them. And there's so many different kinds. So I've added in more flowers this year, and there's more to come.